Demon's Souls gets a bad rap these days. It's routinely considered one of, if not the worst Souls game. Considered primitive and underdeveloped, as if Souls fans have become the modern counterpart to the Sony executives who, long ago, decided against localizing Demon's Souls outside of Japan. What hurts Demon's Souls in retrospect is that as FromSoftware refined the Souls formula, the assumption by players is that each game is an iterative drive towards Elden Ring, and Demon's Souls is often judged by how well it predicts Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, rather than by how well it embodies itself. Which is my highfalutin way of saying, Demon's Souls kicks ass. So, to appreciate it, I've sat down and written thousands of words, and a few more thousands of words for good measure about the Souls games for the video you now sink your slimy tongue into, looking for that gusher burst of sweet content into your mouth. And so, for your eventual pleasure or frustration, let's dive back into 2009, a time before FromSoftware's formerly enigmatic games became a monolith in the gaming landscape, before Souls became a new subgenre of action games, and before these games became the standard by which seemingly all games are judged and compared.
Metroid is like Dark Souls. Castlevania is like Dark Souls. Xanadu is like Dark Souls.
With Elden Ring's shocking mainstream success, I was curious to revisit the reviews for Demon's Souls, FromSoftware's first Soulsborne game, and see how much has changed. I had a memory of Demon's Souls being divisive. It was, at the time, a weird game. Its combat was mechanically demanding, its level structure was unforgiving, and its story was obscure during the console generation that saw the outbreak of cinematic gaming. Yet, to my absolute stunning shock, the reviews for Demon's Souls, or at least the professional reviews, were almost all ahead of their time. Maybe that's not even a fair way to put it. Demon's Souls was so highly regarded that no critic could have been ahead of their time. The time, it seems, started in 2009. Professional video game critics come under a lot of attack a lot of the time, sometimes for good reasons about the industrial relationship between game publishers and publications, but mostly for silly reasons, like how games journalists can't play real games. Cuphead tutorial. 0 out of 10. We couldn't get good. So saith the top comment on the IGN review of Dark Souls, where they gave the game a 9 out of 10. Peering back into 2009, it's actually the hardcore gamers and the outsider critics who hated Demon's Souls. Yahtzee's infamous review of the game has been dragged through the muck extensively, but even smaller independent publications like the website diehardgamefan.com, a website that proudly boasts that we seek to bring back true journalism rather than fluff pieces catering to the lowest common denominator. We hope to revive credibility and integrity to gaming journalism, something that has been increasingly tarnished in recent years. Blasted Demon's Souls. If you're a Souls head, what I'm about to read will drive you crazy, so let's do it.
Compared to other button mashers, it just doesn't feel right. There's a bit of a lag between, say, attacking with your sword and then raising your shield. Considering the timing of these two actions is a matter of life or death in a lot of skirmishes, this gets annoying quickly.
Demon's Souls is a serious hardcore game for seriously hardcore gamers.
Very diehard. The point of this isn't to drag old reviews by amateurs or to exonerate the conflict of interests that many legacy gaming websites and publications have. Many independent critics and reviews praised Demon's Souls. Acorn Films' review was what sold the game to me back in 2010, and Classic Game Room's review has the line,
"This is the game that everybody will be talking about, or at least they should be."
I wonder if Mark Bussler had any idea how right he was when he said this. What I gathered in my obsessive eating of everything Demon's Souls from 2009 is that not much has changed with Souls and its reception other than scale. Demon's Souls went greatest hits on PS3 and won many awards. Elden Ring was a phenomenon that won even more awards. Online, reactionary gamers were steadfastly contrarian, at the time calling GameSpot pretentious for giving their Game of the Year award to Demon's Souls over Uncharted 2 Among Thieves and Batman Arkham Asylum, a fact that feels both intimately familiar and absurdly inverse to the types of games reactionary gamers complain about today. The story of Souls' critical reception is as unremarkable a story as there is to tell. Each game has been highly regarded, popular, and that's about the end of it. Even Matthew Matosas' video on Dark Souls 2 that popularized a lot of criticisms of that game begins with the line,
"I'm being totally genuine when I say I would much rather play Dark Souls 2 than most games that have released in the past few years."
The most intriguing part of the story in Souls' reception is that it was immediate. That in 2009, GameSpot would not only give it Game of the Year, but also say it was the most forward-thinking game of the year, is a remarkable called shot. But we are now 15 years removed from Demon's Souls. When Demon's Souls came out, Doom 2, Final Fantasy VI, and Earthbound were 15 years old. Demon's Souls is now a classic game, although it doesn't feel like that because its influence is institutional at this point. Demon's Souls and its immediate spiritual successor, Dark Souls, changed popular game design philosophy and the very vocabulary people use to talk about games. Yet, after all this time, Demon's Souls is considered the worst game in the Soulsborne series by many players. This, the most forward-looking game of 2009, is also the most rudimentary game in the series graphically, mechanically, and narratively. It lacks the polish and big-budget splendor of Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, and Elden Ring. It's rough. Sometimes the tubas fart. Sometimes the voice acting is awkward. And sometimes the frame rate doesn't work quite right, though that's not really that unique to Demon's Souls. But for a small cohort of players, Demon's Souls remains the true treat of the Soulsborne series. That's me, or at least it has been me for a long time. And when the Souls bug bit me again, as it does every couple of years, I went back to Demon's Souls in its original PS3 version, hooked up to a 5.1 surround sound system, and locked into the game more seriously than I ever had before. Coming into this video, I had played through and beaten all of the Soulsborne games, but I had never taken my time to absorb the story and the lore on my own. To not only read the text in the game, but to relish the sights and sounds, focus on the locations of items and the architecture, and on the state of the world. I replayed every FromSoftware Souls game and Souls adjacent game this year, the year of 2024, which is present as I speak, past as you watch, and this video is the first in a series of essays about the Soulsborne Ring series. I've already made 2 videos on Demon's Souls in the past, so what's a third? It's not like they weren't my most successful ever. You gotta give the algorithm what it wants. And the first video in this series will be about why Demon's Souls is foundational, why it's the house where all Soulsborne lives, both as gameplay and narrative experiences. To peer into the future of this series, playing with a story-driven approach enhances all of FromSoftware's games. We will look at the claim that some players make that FromSoftware's approach to storytelling is laziness masking a non-existent story. We won't address this claim directly, per se, but it will be an undercurrent to all that's said about the Soulsborne series in these videos. These games are told with a lot of delicate imprecision, but that will become more important in Dark Souls. Demon's Souls is a very straightforward story. It lacks the cerebral grandeur and complex ethics of the later games and tells what is, in the end, a simple high fantasy story. King Allant of Boletaria has awakened the Old One, an ancient, great demon that is consuming the world to steal the souls of men. He does this, ostensibly, to harness soul arts. In player-familiar terms, the soul arts are the magic spells that you wield, the flame toss and homing soul arrows that you can kill the demons with in Boletaria. The Old One, a massive, lurching slug locked away in the ethereal space beneath the Nexus, the game's hub world, is a precursor to the Great Ones of Bloodborne and the greater, more mysterious monstrosities of Manus, Father of the Abyss, and Metyr, Mother of Fingers. The Old One is also the target of our nameless adventurer, who's come to the lands of Boletaria to either save the world or harvest the power of the demons. As the player enters Boletaria, the voice of the Monumental, an ancient sage responsible for keeping the Old One sealed away, calls the player a brave soul who fears not death. But doesn't give us a purpose. Neither does the opening exposition. Has Boletaria found its savior, or have the demons found a new slave? The narrator asks, with neither of the above as an unspoken third option. The Soulsborne games aren't often thought of as RPGs in their gameplay, but story playthroughs of these games do interact with role-playing decisions the player has to make. Each game has multiple endings that players can choose based on how they feel about the world and its story, or based on which trophies they still need for the platinum. And in Demon's Souls, the player has to make a decision to save the world, or continue its destruction by taking the power of the demons. This decision isn't so much a question of moral conundrum. In Dark Souls and Dark Souls 3, the decision to prolong the Age of Fire or let the Age of Dark reign is a difficult decision to parse. It's less a question of role-playing, and more a question of ethics and platinum trophies, as the Dark Souls trilogy releases the player into the world as a mindless automaton drifting in the sea of endless time, and not a self-driven adventurer. In Demon's Souls, the question of saving the world is one of role-playing. Are you power-hungry, or are you a hero? Unlike those later Souls games that have no direct opinion about the seasonal ages of Dark and Fire, where the passage of time itself is confusing to so many of the characters, think of the Sullen Vendrick questioning the cycle itself, Demon's Souls frames every character in its present tense narrative with moralizing directness. Every character in Demon's Souls that wants to feast upon souls or let the demon scourge continue is framed as evil or insane. Sage Freak, the Visionary, an NPC the player rescues from the torturous prison of Latria, wants the player to protect the Old One so that he can continue to transform the powerful demon souls into magic. Mephistopheles, a character that appears only after the player has done great evil, sends the player on assassination quests to harness the powerful souls of major NPCs. Not only does the player have to do explicitly cruel acts, murdering characters like Patches, Prince Ostrava, and Bior to progress her quest, her armor set reads, "Equipment of a masked society who meet in secret to discuss the harnessing of souls. Their clandestine affairs are largely unknown." You get this armor from killing her, which is a fair thing to do because she tries to make you murder Bior, which I'm not doing because Bior's a dog, and because she tries to kill you when you complete her quest anyways, because of course she does. To complete her quest, you must roleplay as evil, because this society, these harassers of souls, need your soul to be tainted with demonic cruelty. For most people, I hope, deciding to aid Mephistopheles and help Sage Freak is an act of role-playing more than actual moral identification. What's interesting, though, is that no action taken by the player in the course of the game affects the ending directly. The decision to save or destroy the world isn't a simple binary where the player's good and bad decisions are tabulated and force the game into one ending or another. Unlike some alternate endings in later FromSoftware games, there are no conditions in Demon's Souls. You simply make the decision to help or kill the Maiden in Black after the final boss. This seems no different than the arbitrary decisions given to players in BioShock and Silent Hill Downpour menu pop-ups, that the player can simply forego all their role-playing to choose an ending at will. There is some truth to this, but FromSoftware always keeps control in the player's hands. The decision at the end of the game is isolated from the rest of the game, giving freedom to the player character to reinforce their chosen role, to throw their evil away at the last minute, or to let their electrochemistry win out. A player completing Mephistopheles' quest and then lulling the Old One back to sleep is a sudden act of penance, but for most playthroughs, either of these two choices reflects the world of Demon's Souls. Every act of heroism corrupts the soul by taking the souls of the demons into the player, and every act of villainy cleanses the world of a demon. This duality is most clear during the Maiden Astraea boss fight, one of the game's most famous set pieces. Maiden Astraea is one of those, "oh, am I the bad guy" moments that are easy to make fun of, even in Demon's Souls, for being cheap pathos. Maiden Astraea is found at the bottom of the Valley of Defilement, the first Soulsborne poison lake and a land of slithering pestilence. The valley is where the poor and sick and criminal and unwanted and deformed of Boletaria have been dumped, perhaps long before the Old One reawoke, and Astraea sits at the bottom of the valley, in a pit of plague and suffering filled with the reanimated remains of aborted and forgotten and stillborn babies. Bodies run down from the waterfalls that fill the still waters at the base. Astraea's Knight Protector, Garl Vinland, sits among the dead bodies that pollute the bottom of the valley. Astraea herself is a saint of the unnamed church that worships an unknown god that could be the Old One, or Jesus Christ for all we know. The filthy woman refers to the Virgin Mary when sneering about Maiden Astraea, and she has absorbed the suffering of the valley into her soul, and accepted becoming a demon to ease the suffering souls of the people of the valley. The opening cinematic begins with, "On the first day, man was granted a soul, and with it, clarity. This clarity, in my mind, is cognition, thought, awareness, the capabilities that allow man to conceive and build the great castles of Boletaria and grand tombs at the bottom of the Shrine of Storms, and the hatred to construct the torturous Iron Maidens in the Tower of Latria and throw the unwanted into the rotting slums of the Valley of Defilement. Great achievement and great cruelty are foundational, but the capacity to suffer is the burden of clarity. Astraea relieves this suffering by absorbing the souls of the unwanted and taking away their clarity. Their bodies may live on as toxic husks, but they can no longer suffer. When we slash and backstab and burn them, they suffer as a worm torn apart by a bird. If we approach the Astraea fight normally, we kill Garl Vinland and then talk to Astraea, who kills herself, greeting us for our hungry quest for the demon's souls. After sitting on this scene for over a decade, what strikes me the most about this isn't the overtones of "am I the bad guy?" but the necessity of it. If I am the bad guy, greedily eating up souls, then yeah, I'm the bad guy. I'm doing this for the souls. But as the heroic warrior, I am taking the demon souls to satiate and put the Old One back to sleep. Killing Astraea is an individual tragedy because she is doing what she believes will ease the world of its suffering. In this small, wretched corner of Boletaria, she's right, but in the end, she is providing relief as Allant and the demons slowly consume the world. Her death and her soul are needed to end the demon scourge, and so, on the eminently personal level, to her and Garl Vinland, and to the shambling husks of the former dwellers of the valley, we are a villainous interloper. Considering this world has Sage Freak, Mephistopheles, Yurt the Silent Chief, Allant, and the corpulent fat officials, along with the untold soul seekers who've come for Astraea's soul and fallen to the plague and to Garl Vinland, Astraea assuming our evil intent is natural in a world as hateful as this one. In the boss arena itself, you find a legendary hero's soul, perhaps of one of those power-hungry demon slayers. And of course, depending on the ending we choose at the end of the demon hunt, Astraea might be right to fear our heart.
The Old One senses a new and powerful demon by its side. And before long, the world will be engulfed by the deep fog. Bring more souls.
I've referenced Allant a couple of times, mostly vaguely, because Allant's story and motivations are the one misstep with the game's story, a hollow din at the end of the game. Because of the opening cutscene, the assumption throughout the game is that Allant rediscovered and reawakened the Old One so that the magical soul arts could bring Boletaria extraordinary prosperity. A classic tale of hubris and ignoring all consequences, and everything blowing up all over his mixed metaphor wax wings. That is, until you finally meet the true King Allant. After defeating his demonic projection at the very top of Boletaria, you plunge deep into the Nexus, seemingly at the bottom of existence itself, and find Allant, deformed and mutated, slithering around inside the Old One. There, he states his true goal for the eradication of all life, to end the suffering of existence, because no one wants to go on.
Surely you have seen for yourself the pain and suffering that fills this world. But God is merciful, so created the Old One. Poison to poison. The Old One will feed upon our souls and put an end to this tragedy. You fool! Don't you understand? No one wishes to go on.
Turns out, at the ends of the earth, at the bottom of the universe, that Allant was just a Philip Mainlander fanboy wanting to eradicate the soul of man to get rid of the clarity that brings us suffering. Compared to Gwyn, Allant's motivation is sophomoric as a dramatic driver. As we'll see throughout the Dark Souls trilogy, the fundamental struggle of that series is the inability to let life fade, the desire to desperately cling to any existence no matter how pathetic and painful. Gwyn and Vendrick are tragic figures because they desperately cling to life until they are burned away and hollowed. Allant provides little of this pathos because he's simplistic in an uninteresting way. Destroying life because life sucks is edgy, I guess, and perhaps I dislike it because I disagree with it, but it also undermines the mechanics of Allant's fight. He sits there, barely able to move, haplessly flailing at the player to stop them from putting the old one to sleep, but this powerless, pathetic Allant plays less effective as a juxtaposition to his desired power and the power we assumed he had, because he wasn't seeking power. If anything, the true mechanical tragedy of this fight, and the most rapturous part of Allant's story, is that he's one of only 2 bosses that talks to you, and the only thing he wants is to lose his clarity, his cognition. He must sit here and stir in his mind, even as his body dissipates into muck. The final boss has always been controversial because of its ease, because of how mechanically anticlimactic it is after the fight with Allant's false self. I've always been a true King Allant truther, because look at how his mad quest has warped his body. It's deeply thematic and appropriate, and that's what I always said before hyper-focusing on his dialogue. It's still appropriate, but less crushing, less moving. He's getting his karmic justice, but is less viscerally stunning. I won't sit and argue that False King Allant would be a better final fight. If anything, his instinctual drive to destroy you, and to do so without words, is a perfect projection of the soulless fate that Allant wants for all men. People frequently complain that False King Allant doesn't speak, but it's thematically and narratively evocative that his first instinct is to destroy us. I mean, this is the same son of a bitch who attacked his own son, sight unseen off screen. I really don't think he has words for us. That son, Prince Astraea, is the only major NPC questline in the game that's multi-step, spans the entire game, and most players are likely to experience in its totality. Those 3 filters don't just make Prince Astraea's quest rare among Demon Souls, but rare amongst the entire FromSoftware catalog. NPC questlines in Souls become more involved as the games progress, and almost all of them are easily missed, even in Elden Ring. What makes these quests so exciting is that they don't have much concern for the player completing them. The characters in the Souls games are independent agents, and while the player can steer the direction of the character's life by certain actions, by answering questions in certain ways, finding or missing an appearance by the character, or just prematurely killing them, the quests are designed for the characters first, instead of the player. The Rhea of Thorland quest in Dark Souls is advanced in the Tomb of the Giants, a late-game area, and is concluded by returning to the Undead Parish, an early-game area. Yes, it's highly unlikely the player will ever find this on their own. It's unfriendly to blind players. Hell, it's unfriendly to veteran players because it sends you to the Tomb of the Giants, one of Dark Souls' many I really don't want to do this areas. But that's because the quest is about Rhea, not the player. For story hounds and the virtuous, completing character quests requires going out of the way. But these character stories can also be cut short to the benefit of vulturous players.
To you, thank you so very much. Here, these belonged to them. You deserve them more than I.
Now, unlike character quests, one thing that's not easy to miss is this channel's Patreon. If you're enjoying this video and are able to do so, consider supporting the channel on Patreon or on YouTube as a YouTube member. If you do, not only will you get early access to video scripts, videos, and Patreon-exclusive essays, but also to a Patreon-exclusive Game Club Discord server, where every month we play a game together and discuss it. We just wrapped up playing Parasite Eve together, and in February we will be playing the Sin and Punishment duology. Supporting is as cheap as $1 a month or $10.80 a year. The names you see on screen are my current supporters on Patreon and on YouTube. Thank you all so much for your support. While the quest lines in Demon Souls are rudimentary compared to the later games, many of the formative elements are established here, including the ability to gain late-game items early by killing the NPCs that carry them, instead of waiting for them to be rewarded to the player like a chump. Check out this insanity. Kick Astraea off this cliff into the enemies and then run around and aggro all the enemies to him until they overwhelm him and he dies. Loot his body for the Mausoleum Key. Run up, enter the tomb of Old King Doran, beat the shit out of him, and collect the Demon Brand, an incredibly powerful weapon in the early game. We could kill Astraea ourselves, but that would lower our character tendency, and we need that high because Demon Brand scales off of character tendency. So you know what? Let's get some better character tendency. Let's take Old King Doran and kick him off a staircase. You'll get a stamina regeneration ring, and some of the best armor in the game from this, and it will lower the world tendency of Boletaria to pure black, which means we can access this locked gate at the beginning of 1-1 and kill the Black Phantom Executioner Meralda, which will raise our character tendency and thus the scaling of Demon Brand. This is hateful, and honestly not super worth it. The servers for Demon Souls PS3 version have long since shut down, so grinding out invasions for pure white character tendency isn't doable anymore. But it's still an incredibly powerful option for early in the game, and will let the player stomp through all the Stage 1 levels. In the Souls ethos, being resourceful by any means necessary is key to success. Sometimes there's value to being a huge douchebag. Killing Astraea in level 1-1 means you don't have to wait until level 1-4 to gain access to Old King Doran. But also, sometimes being heroic pays off. Saving Bior in level 1-2 means he'll help with the Penetrator boss fight and with the Blue Dragon encounter in 1-4. Save Yuria the Witch in level 1-3 and she'll set up shop in the Nexus, where you can transpose boss souls into some powerful boss spells. Playing Demon Souls again with the foreknowledge of the Dark Souls trilogy, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring makes the NPC quests the most dated aspect of Demon Souls, even more than its oft-criticized bosses. Other than Astraea and Mephistopheles, none of the NPCs have quest lines that last more than one step. Survive a trap set up by Patches the Hyena, and he sets up shop as a merchant. Rescue Grave Robber Blige, and he sets up shop as a merchant. Show Stockpile Thomas the Jade Hair Ornament from the daughter he left to die in the Demon Scourge, and you get some dialogue, and that's the end of his quest. You can't even tell him about the maggot-infested clothes of his wife you find, or that both of their bodies are chained and hanged over the gates of Boletaria. Although I personally wouldn't tell him that, as to not drive the item storage NPC mad. Again, everything here is formative, but primeval. Bior of the Twin Fang's appearance during the Penetrator fight is the only instance of an NPC joining for a boss fight, a feature that would become ubiquitous with NPC summons in future games. While the rudimentary main narrative and NPC quests are where the game plays the most dated, it's rare to see Demon Souls criticized for this because what is absolutely fully formed at this early date is the atmosphere. The tone of Demon Souls is as oppressive as any game in the Soulsborne series, and is perhaps the most oppressive. The ethereal whooshing in the menus, the blue aura that envelops the body in soul form, the scribbled text underneath the banner messages when a boss is defeated or when the player dies, the unnerving quietness of the Nexus theme, the sounds of the scavenging crows of Boletaria, the cackling of the fat officials driving the tireless, soulless workers of Stonefang Tunnel, the row of dead monumentals that decorate the upper floors of the Nexus, the hollow, strained grunts of the dreglings that greet the player at the beginning of the journey, the mechanical oppression of the lopped-off max HP bar in soul form and world tendency, the ancient, unevolved primeval demons that lurk in each world as it approaches pure black tendency, and the general despondency of everyone you meet. At the outset of the adventure, not only do you die at the hands of either the Vanguard or the Dragon God, but everyone in the Nexus is either depressed, crestfallen, missing, dead, or an asshole. Even compared to the following games, the despair in Demon Souls is thick. Although the fear is palpable in later games, the graceful speed and ease that the player moves with from Bloodborne onwards gives some semblance of hope through the fear. The slow, metallic clanging of dodging and clashing swords and shields, and the PS3 mud, and the console's chugging fan, and the gloom of the gray battlements and brown mire and rain of the Valley of Defilement. This is in addition to its strange difficulty, a difficulty that was understood much differently in 2009 than in 2025. Pretty much the instant Demon's Souls released, it was infamous for its difficulty. While not every review focused on the difficulty, some did in incredibly hyperbolic terms. The IGN review by Sam Bishop features the observation that
there's no bank, no second chances, no way to put off the inevitable. You will die in this game. When in this soulless form, you'll be permanently stripped of a chunk of your life meter. You will lose all of your cash, and you will hate that every once in a while it's because you got pushed. Okay, you accidentally rolled off a cliff. But you'll keep coming back because the game is quite simply one of the best on the PlayStation 3.
Bishop goes on to ask the question,
how can they possibly call this a must-have experience?
The review concludes that Demon's Souls kind of is and kind of isn't a must-have experience, and some of that wishy-washiness came from the game's difficulty. I would argue that the game's tone, the oppressive atmosphere that crushes down on each step taken, plays a huge part in its difficulty, and much more than we realized in 2009. The atmosphere of Demon's Souls puts players, especially new players, on their heels. Even in those 2009 reviews, difficulty is often talked about as a demon that can be easily excised. Stamina consciousness, attack animations, magic, bows, multiplayer, and good old-fashioned grinding are given as potential ways to offset and overcome difficulty. Classic Game Room's review notes that the difficulty in the game is more slight than it might first appear to be because you can tackle areas in different orders and individual situations with a multitude of different solutions. I'm not going to sit here and say that the Souls games aren't hard. They certainly are. However, the early reception of Demon's Souls shows that overwhelming, unfair, bullshit difficulty wasn't the popular perception of the game at first. Certainly Demon's Souls and later Dark Souls were perceived as unfair nonsense, but that had as much to do with extracurricular homework, like the Prepare to Die subtitle given to the PC release of Dark Souls, getting a trophy for your first death in Dark Souls 2, the endless sophistry around easy modes and accessibility, and a steady flow of discourse around the difficulty and what it should or should not be. This will be more relevant with the later games, as this discourse has mostly been stapled onto Demon's Souls retroactively, both because of the ever-ballooning successes of Soulsborne and the 2020 remake. Demon's Souls' approach to difficulty is perhaps the most holistic in the series until Elden Ring. There is impetus on the player to get more skilled. The first level of the game has to be beaten before the player can level up or jump between the different Mario worlds offered up. There are some fights that are mechanical roadblocks, like Flame Lurker, the Man-Eaters, and False King Allant, and certain areas that are long gauntlets, like the Shrine of Storms and Valley of Defilement. This is a difficult game with several very difficult fights and levels, but the game gives armor, weapons, accessories, spells, and miracles that directly counter most of the challenges in the game. If the player is struggling to dodge Flame Lurker's big splash attacks, a fire shield like the Purple Flame Shield, fire-resistant armor, and the spell Water Veil will massively cut down on Flame Lurker's damage. The Man-Eaters are a gank fight, where they often fly away, so poison from the Mercury Rapier +1 found early in the Tower of Latria can put constant tick damage on them even as they can't be attacked. The poison damage from the swamp in the Valley of Defilement can be completely trivialized with the Adjudicator's Shield, the Regenerator Ring, and the Bless Mace +1 found earlier in the Valley of Defilement, 3 items that all stack passive HP recovery on the player. None of these tricks make the game easy. The Mercury Rapier strategy on the Man-Eaters is more funny than it is worth it. I won't do it, even for footage. It's just there as an option. But options aplenty abound. Demon's Souls remains fairly tough, especially back in 2009 before the Souls formula began infecting the entire gaming landscape. But the grand multitude of options and tricks funnel the difficulty. The HP recovery equipment completely removes poison from the player's list of problems in the Valley of Defilement, and that regained focus can be spent on handling enemies and navigating the big open swamp. Fire damage reduction against Flame Lurker doesn't trivialize the fight, but it does vastly expand the margin of error the player has. Surviving more hits greatly moves the needle in the player's favor. This difficulty philosophy will survive through the whole series, although its overall impact will shrink in games like Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3. Played now, after over a decade and a half of Souls, many of the powerful adventure tools given to the player do fiercely break the challenge of the game. The stuff that was really difficult in 2009 that couldn't be augmented away, the slow healing animations, attack and shield windups, stamina management, is now ingrained in the gaming lexicon, a collective muscle memory. These deliberate, restrictive design choices were unintuitive at the time, but now they are anything but. Dodging through False King Allant's jumping attacks is natural today for anyone well-versed in not just Souls, but Hades, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, and Pokemon Legends Arceus. There's a really funny bit in Zero Punctuation's review of Demon's Souls Remake where he says,
There were a couple of hard bits where progress stalled, but eventually I realized that this was before FromSoftware figured out how to counteract the all-purpose Dark Souls strategy, i.e. roll behind them when they attack and administer a violent suppository.
While some of that comment comes from Yahtzee himself getting better at the games over the course of a decade, some of it, I argue, comes from our collective understanding of action games changing. As the phrase Souls-like took over the world, it's even recognized as a word on Google Docs, a ton of discussion and bickering has focused on defining what exactly a Souls-like is and what elements they take from the Souls games. An answer to that question is so hard to nail down, partially because the influence of Demon's Souls, unseen at the time, was how it prioritized animations and stamina as its combat currency. As pointed out by Noah Caldwell-Gervais in his Dark Souls Trilogy video, Souls combat is about exchanging animations. Unlike Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, combo strings are de-emphasized in favor of understanding animations. In a 3-swing piece sword combo, the game is less concerned with you stringing those attacks together successfully through properly sequenced button and analog stick inputs than it is with you understanding what all these attacks look like and what their effects on an enemy's animations will be. Against low-level enemies, you can often stun them with every hit of a weapon, allowing for those longer strings. Sometimes, big enemies move so slow that you have the time for your animations to go off. Other times, as you'll see throughout the footage of this video, a slower pace, repeating the first sword slash of a combo, is what you need to pace your animations properly. The same applies for defense. Barring these stray bad hitbox, attacks throughout the Souls series are dealt with by positioning yourself relative to their animations. Dodge through attacks so they move through you. Block attacks so that their animations are cut short. Or, the most heinous, strafe around an animation. The trick to defeating many bosses in the series, from the Adjudicator and the Pursuer all the way to Melania Blade of Mikola, is knowing where their attacks go. A general tip that helps with many of the big enemies in Souls and other Souls-like games is to move to where their attacks can't hit you. In Matthew Matosis' video, The Lost Soul Arts of Demon's Souls, he comments that these games don't have deep action systems.
Even with the addition of trick weapons, there's still a case to be made that overall the combat doesn't even have depth exceeding basic action games. If you're a staunch defender of the series, this is where you might be tempted to rattle off all the different attack animations your favourite weapon has. After all, there's two-handed attacks, jumping attacks, running attacks, charged attacks, transformation attacks, and probably more. It's true that there are differences in range and damage, but the effect on the enemy is usually identical.
The mistake I believe he makes here is not the one he anticipates. He mixes up intuitiveness with simplicity. The depth of Souls combat comes from understanding animations. In some of the early reviews praising Demon's Souls, you will see reviews using heavy longsword attacks while in tunnels, not because the damage values are different, but because the thrusting animation is more valuable in these tight corridors because it won't boink off of the walls. The depth in Demon's Souls' combat doesn't seem deep to the naked eye because it's intuitively simple. Dodge the attack and hit the monster, and accomplishing that comes from understanding the game's animations. This design philosophy will last all the way to the present day, even through the furiously aggressive Sekiro and through the boundless customization of Elden Ring. Sometimes the best option you have in Souls combat isn't to do the most complex sequence of dodges, but to strafe left and avoid the enemy attack animations altogether. This intuitiveness is simple, and this simplicity is often the challenge. I don't know about all you, but sometimes I assume the answer in any video game is the most complicated solution I can execute, when in Souls, it's often the simplest. What's particularly fascinating about Demon's Souls in retrospect is how simple it now seems. In 2009, this game felt impossibly difficult because of its combat and the cryptic mechanics that underlined the whole experience. Demon's Souls, like all the Souls games, remains difficult, especially for players new to the series, but after 15 years of getting blitzed by massive bosses like Manus, Father of the Abyss, the Fume Knight, Orphan of Kos, Dark Eater Midir, Ishin the Sword Saint, and Malekith the Black Blade, there's a quaintness to bosses like the Tower Knight, who are quite simple even if he continues to give trouble to new players. The bosses of Demon's Souls provide a glimpse at how the series' preoccupations have evolved. Comparing a standard Demon's Souls enemy to a standard Dark Souls 3 enemy shows a nuclear arms race between player skill and the challenges these games are willing to throw at the player. The gameplay challenges in Demon's Souls don't demand as much studying of the enemies, but rather dealing with simple tasks made complicated by the game's environments. The Adjudicator and the Leechmonger require the player to get down to the boss to engage them in honorable combat, and by honorable, I mean lighting Leechmonger on fire with a Dragon Claymore, or to find a way to kill them from the high ground. The Adjudicator is easier at ground level. I have actually died to the Adjudicator when trying to fight from the top of the arena, while the Leechmonger is easier from the top of the arena if you can do it. The Tower Knight becomes much easier if you clear the archers out. The Fool's Idol is an impossible boss if you don't kill the enchanter above the arena before entering the fight. Here's a clip of Vivian Alladrin getting trolled by the Fool's Idol gimmick in their first playthrough of the remake.
Bopper, where the fuck am I going now? Like, I killed the Fool's Idol. No, I did not.
Congratulations. Demon's Souls is the Souls game most concerned with navigational precariousness. In Dark Souls 3, the regular enemies in the Grand Archives, one of the final areas in the game, are appropriately challenging. They're fast, bulky, and stand as one final test of the player's mettle before they face off against the Twin Princes and the Soul of Cinder. The enemies in Demon's Souls' hardest area, the Valley of Defilement, are actually quite easy. Most of them get totally borked by shields, and the Plague Rats are easy enough to pick off with range. The only enemy that's a challenge are the giant depraved ones, yet players die over and over and over again in both Valley of Defilement levels because fighting these simple enemies is made much worse by the number of bottomless pits that flank all sides of the level, the narrow walkways and bridges, and the poison swamp that hinders player movement. Environmental difficulty is core to Demon's Souls' challenge, which is why so many tools in the game like magic and bows are so strong. It isn't because they are numerically or innately strong, although they are, but because they allow the player to circumvent environmental mishaps by breaking apart big groups of enemies or by bringing fights onto more stable terrain. Notice that the hardest regular enemies in the game, the skeletons in the Shrine of Storms, almost always fight you on fairly open terrain, or in tunnels that cannot kill you because they have walls, unlike the rafters in the Valley of Defilement that can kill you because they do not have walls. The combat iteration in Demon's Souls runs on the same philosophy as the Anorlando archers: put dangerous enemies in stable locations and easy enemies in unstable locations. And yes, I do mean to imply that the Anorlando archers are easy enemies in an unstable location. For all of its careful construction and enemy encounter and environmental design, much of the challenge that has remained with Demon's Souls over the years comes from its esoteric mechanics. World Tendency is, at this point, an infamous mechanic that's only explained in the miscellaneous pool of exposition in the Nexus tutorial mash that punishes new players, rewards experienced players, and forces the story playthrough types like me to constantly kill themselves in the Nexus. Well, I say, entering a level in human form, I almost forgot to kill myself today. The Souls games have largely abandoned mechanics like World Tendency or cutting your HP in half while in soul form, and that does suck a little bit, because much of the appeal of Demon's Souls at the time came from the promise of its bizarre mechanics. It was only natural that the series would streamline and reduce the weight of some of the blunter tools in this trial run. I doubt many players miss item burden, and perhaps fewer still miss how difficult it is to obtain upgrade materials or how specific the conditions are to infuse or transform your weapons. To upgrade the big strength weapons like the Bastard Sword, you need 74 shards of Hardstone, 36 large shards of Hardstone, 18 Hardstone chunks, and 1 pure Hardstone. These values differ across different weapons, and if you want to adjust your weapon to make it pure strength, you need to get it to +3, or sometimes keep it at +0, and infuse it with Greystone. And then to get the pure Greystone, you must either complete a side quest dependent on World Tendency, or farm them from a specific enemy, which is preferable to the pure Moonlight Stone I needed to complete my Magic Longsword, because there is no guaranteed drop in the game, and the only enemies that have a chance to drop them are Crystal Lizards that do not respawn and don't always drop them. It's great, and I think that's my opportunity to let everybody in on a horrible secret, which is whenever I play Demon's Souls, I use the item duplication glitch to get unlimited upgrade materials. Is it cheating? Absolutely. Am I cheating not just the game, but myself? Absolutely. I didn't grow. I didn't improve. I took a shortcut, but I actually gained everything. by not having to buy dozens of shards from the merchants, so it's actually debatable, and I faced the consequences and suffered horribly at the hands of the Man-Eater's ice rink arena. For all of its wild experimentation and ideas that go nowhere and story beats that don't fully work, Demon's Souls works by sheer force of will, something I can't quite say about any of the games that follow it. It is the foundation. It is also the entire house. What the future FromSoftware games do is complicate the world of Demon's Souls with drives into apocalyptic miasma and confusion. The morals aren't so clear. The happenings of the world aren't so clear. What is prologue and what is future in the worlds of their later stories are unclear. It's within these apocalyptic visions that we will resume our journey through the Soulsborne series next time, with Dark Souls. Just keep in mind as we journey through that every game left is a picture in a frame hanging on the wall of Demon's Souls' crusty living room.
The Old One, along with the Maiden, were swept back into the lulling fog. Boletaria was spared from the demons, but also lost its knowledge of soul arts. The souls lost during the pandemonium were never retrieved. And today, the unstable world has another monumental to hold its fabric together. A brave new hero of unprecedented power.